Much of this week's staff is B'nai Trumos and Umaasrois. We're learning Beitza, Maseches Beitza, Daf Yud Gimel, Amud Aleph, Amud Beis. Goes through a lot of Trumos and Umaasrois. It also happens to be that this week, Parshas Korach, the Torah lists in this week's Parsha the Chaf Dalet Matnas Kahuna. And in the Chaf Dalet Matnas Kahuna, we have in this week's Parsha the Matnas Kahuna of Trumos and Umaasrois. Asher Al Kain, I would like to spend time in this morning's Shiur as an overview, call it a Shiur Kloli, in the halachas of Trumos and Umaasrois. Now, in the halachas of Trumos and Umaasrois, before I begin, just to clarify, you could learn it for a year, for 3 years. We're not going to be able to cover now in under 30 minutes to go through all the halachas. And I myself don't know all the halachas, ubefrat, because if you don't live in Eretz Yisrael, it's not noyeg, yoim yoim. You don't know all the pratei dinim, lemaisa, what's noyeg bizman hazeh. But at least to open up, it's negeya, some of the things are mamash on our blat, it's negeya the parsha, and it's mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz. I'm going to begin going through the matanos, Trumos and Umaasrois. It's all in this week's parsha. Not all the Trumos and Umaasrois, but some of them. The ones that are negeya to kahuna from the Chaf Dalet Matnas Kahuna. The first one is Truma. Truma, you take off Truma min haTorah, the Shiur Truma. There's no Shiur. Like the Gemara says, Chita achas poiteres es akri. Let's say you have a wheat field, you could take off one wheat, one kernel, one wheat, one chita, one stalk, and it's enough. And that's Truma. Truma you give to the Kohen, this week's Parsha. Perek Yud Ches, Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'zel L'cha Trumas Matanam. The Pasuk says you give Truma to the Kohen. Weiter in the pasuk which is not to the Kohen but rather to the Levi. After you give Truma, you give to the Levi Meiser. Meiser, you give it to the Levi, which we know that's Meiser Rishon. Meiser, what's the Shiur for Meiser? Meiser is a tenth. So Truma min haTorah ein lo Shiur, even a mashu. Midrabanon, it's one of 40, one of 50, one of 60. Ayin Yafa, which is more, one of 40, one of 50, one of 60? 40. One of 40. Very good, one of 40. Good Menachem, one of 40. That's giving more. So a ayin yafa, you give one of 40. A beinani is one of 50. And somebody that's a little bit, so to speak, ayin yafa, ayin raw, stingy, gives one of 60. That's truma. Meiser rishon, you give to the Levi. And that's one of 10. Now, obviously, it's not one of 10 of your whole field, because you already took off from your field and you gave to the Kohen. So whether if you took off a little bit, or if you took off, you gave one of 40, one of 50, whatever you're left with. If you're left with 100 tons of tvua, 10 tons go to the Levi. That's Meiser Rishon. Next, which is not in what the Yisrael, the farmer gives, but important to note, these Trumas Meiser, which is a din for the Levi, it's not for the farmer, for the Levi. The Levi got Meiser, he got 10%, so let's say there was 100 tons of tuah, he got 10 tons of tuah. From that, the Levi gives Trumas Meiser to the Kohen. So from the 10 tons that he got, he gives 1 ton to the Kohen. So we have Truma, which min haTorah ein lo Shiur. Meiser, which is to the Levi, is 10%. The Levi gives Trumas Meiser, and that's also 10% of what he has. What'd you say? Trumas Meiser is 10%. Yes. I said differently? No, it is 10%. The 10% avada. The Torah actually calls it Meiser min haMeiser. The Lashon HaPasuk, this week's parsha, yeah. It's Meiser, it's 10%. It's negeya bizman hazeh Maybe we'll get to it at the end a little bit, but just to point out, Bizman Hazeh, Truma, Min HaTorah's Ein Lo Shiur. So really, Bizman Hazeh, we just take off a little bit, because we anyways don't give it to the Kohen, we anyways have to l'sreifa, we dump it, we can't use it. But Trumas Meiser, there's no Be'erach, Trumas Meiser is 10%, yes, 10%. The Levi takes off 10% to give to the Kohen.
And Trumas Meiser at the same din as regular Truma?
Yes, Menachem, very good, well asked, yes. For most of the dinim, almost all the dinim, you are asking if it has the same dinim, Trumas Meiser as Truma, yes. It's called Truma, and for Kamat, all the dinim, it's the same. For the basic dinim, for sure, but even other dinim, the Lashon Rambam, we'll get to it also, the Rashba says nirali by a certain thing, he says nirali that it's the same din, because usually Trumas Meiser and Truma are the same, have the same dinim, Samela, even other dinim as well.
Why is it 10%? Why is it 10% if it's basically the same as regular Truma?
So it's really asking, why is it 10% a Shiur? It's a good Shaila, why is it 10%? It's different than Truma. And we'll get to that as well. I'm not going to answer you why is it 10%. That's what the Eibishter wants. That's the Gzeres HaKasev. But interesting, we're going to see the Rishonim speak about when it's Hukash. One of the Rishonim asks, we'll get to it, but just to answer your question, why is it Taka a different Shiur? The Rishonim say it's Hukash. Maybe it should be Hukash to say that Truma also, Trumas Meiser should also be Ein Lo Shiur. So that the Rishonim say it can't be, because the Torah says Mefurish, Meiser Min HaMeiser. So the Meiser, that's the clear, very good. The Ilm is bringing it up. This is just to get the basics, the clear clarity. Truma, Meiser, and Trumas Meiser. There's another Meiser, which is Meiser Sheni. Meiser Sheni is not in this week's parsha. Meiser Sheni is in two places, in Vayikra, Parshas Korach. The pasuk says, V'chol Meiser ha'oretz mizera ha'oretz b'priya eitz. You take off Meiser Sheni. What do you do with the Meiser Sheni? So the pasuk says, L'Hashem, you give it to the Eibishter. Pasuk, Meiser Sheni. It's not in this week's parsha because it's not Matnas Kahuna. You don't give it to the Kohen. But what does it mean you give it to Hashem? So there's another pasuk to understand the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. The pasuk says, V'chalta l'fnei Hashem elekecha. Which means Meiser Sheni, the din is you have to eat in Yerushalayim. So it is, the fruits are Kadosh, they're Hashem's fruits, and the Eibishter gave it to the farmers to eat, but they have to eat in Yerushalayim. Now there's a din, of course, you live somewhere far away, and to bring all the fruits till it gets there, it'll be rotten. So the Torah gives the idea, you've atzarta kesev, you could be machalol, the kedusha of the peiros, onto money, and for money back when you come to Yerushalayim to buy fruits. And that's Meiser Sheni. However, there's another pasuk, and this is in Parshas Kisavai. The pasuk says, Ki sechala b'shana shlishi shnas ha'meiser. The pasuk says in the third year, how Rashi explains Shnas HaMa'aser Lashon Yachid, one Meiser. So Rashi explains the third year there's no Meiser Sheni, only Meiser Rishon, because the pasuk says La Levi, but instead of Meiser Sheni, there's Meiser Ani, which is also 10%. So the third year and the sixth year, instead of taking off Meiser Sheni and eating Yerushalayim, you give Meiser Ani. So it's very clear. We have Truma, you give to the Kohen, Min HaTorah, no Shiur, Midrabanan, 1 of 40, 50, 60. You have Meiser, which you give to the Levi. You have the Levi gives to the Kohen, Trumas Meiser. Then you also have either Meiser Sheni, which is years 1, 2, 4, and 5. And you also have years 3 and 6, you have Meiser Ani. So we know now what the matanas are. Now, let's move on to see, what do you have to give Trumas and Meisers from? Midrabanan, I'm just going to jump to the Rabbanon, just, if you only listen to this part, Midrabanan, everything is mechuyev b'Trumas and Meisers. When I say everything, I mean fruits and I mean vegetables. The Rambam says clearly in Perik Beis, everything is mechuyev. However, Midairaisa, what's mechuyev Midairaisa? So let's take a look in this week's parsha. The pasuk in this week's parsha called Chelev Yitzar. Yitzar is oil. The Chol Chelev Tirosh wine, V'dogan and grain. The psukim here and the other places in Trumos Umaasrois, the pasuk says, you know what's mechuyev with Trumos Umaasrois? Grain, the chameshes mean a dogon, oil and wine. So what's about everything else? Any other fruits? Bin Torah. The Rambam, Shitas Rambam, that it's true the Torah Taka says these three, but the Rambam holds all fruits are mechuyev min Torah. Not vegetables, but fruits. Fruits are mechuyev min Torah. However, this Shitas Rambam is a chiddush. A lot of Rishonim argue. Tosfos in many places. Tosfos in Rosh Hashanah, and Bechoros, and Bab Metzia. The Ramban and other Rishonim argue and say that the Chiyuv min Torah is only dogon, a grain, and Tirosh v'Yitzar, oil and wine. However, in these three minim, there's another machlokes Rishonim. The Ramban, Shitas Ramban, it's two places ala Torah, Parshas Mishpatim, and I think it's Parshas Kisavai. The Ramban says that, you know, in Mechuyev min Torah, not only no other fruits, but even in Tirosh and Yitzar, only wine and oil is Mechuyev, not grapes and olives. Means when the Torah says Tirosh v'Yitzar, oil and wine, it's literally not the oil that comes from olives, which means olives are mechuyev and grapes are mechuyev, only oil and wine. The Ramban explains with this, the Torah says, M'loi ascha v'dim acher loi sa'acher. Meaning to say is, you have to bring M'loi ascha, Rashi says, from Chazal, is referring to Bikurim. Why is it Bikurim? Meleya. Because you only mechuyev Bikurim once it's mole, once it's full. V'dim acha is referring to Trumos Umaasrois. So Rashi says, I don't understand why dim acha is referring to Trumos Umaasrois. What shayches? Milei ascha I understand, because milei ascha is mole, is full, bikurim. But what's dim acha? What does dim acha have to do with Trumos Umaasrois? Says the Ramban, you know what dim acha is? Dim acha is tears. Tears is liquid. So dimacha, Trumos Umaasrois is only from dimacha, only from the liquid. Of course, he's dogon also, but the liquid, the hainu, wine and oil are not grapes and olives. That's Shitas Ramban.
Why don't we say by dogon as well then?
What's your question?
Why don't we say it by dogon as well?
That only liquid, you're asking, liquid should also, dogon seemingly, dogon is grain, so it has nothing to do with liquid. You can maybe make a liquid out of it. What'd you say?
Comes from.
So agav, okay, so you're asking like this. Maybe, first of all, you're asking maybe dogon should also have to be liquid. So what type of liquid? Menachem, that's you're asking, Swilly. So Menachem, you're saying you have alcohol. So first of
the schnapps is not coming from the.
Oh, very good. Meaning to say is, I don't think that's called exactly. Let me explain. Oil and wine, that's the fruit itself, exactly. Masha'in came, the alcohol, ad kedei kach, people that don't sell chametz gomer, one of the reasons you could sell is because it's considered zeya, which means it's not really the fruit itself, it's not the dogon. But I think even a little bit of a simpler answer to what you're asking, maybe that should also have to be liquid. The Torah says dogon is grain. You may be able to make a liquid out of it. Tirosh v'Yitzar, the Torah says clearly liquid. Now, when the Torah says dimacha, that the Ramban says it's referring to liquid, meaning to say is because a lot of truma is from liquid. But the Ramban's raya is that if you have to give truma from grapes and from oil. Why is truma b'chalal called dimacha liquid? You could give it from liquid. Seemingly, there are certain trumas that you could only give from liquid. That's the Ramban. Many Rishonim argue, there are Rishonim that argue on this Ramban and say that no, they agree partially to the Ramban that if the grapes and the olives are made for oil, then you only mechuyev only when it's oil. You can only take Trumas and Maasros when it's oil and wine. But grapes that you make for food, to eat, the grapes that are planted to eat, and the olives that are planted to eat, those are mechuyev min haTorah and Trumas and Maasros as grapes and olives. So we have over here so far 3 shitas Rishonim in the Chiv min haTorah. The first shita is the Rambam that holds all fruits are mechuyev min haTorah. Shitas Ramban only oil and wine, and the third shita is it depends. If you eat the grapes, you're mechuyev in grapes, and if you don't eat it, it's for wine and oil. Then only wine and oil. Fourth shita, Chodesh the Geshita, the Ritva brings the Ravid. They say it could be was Chayzer, is that the Shivas Aminim are the ones that are mechuyev min haTorah. Fourth shita. So we have over here like this. We began this year with going through the different matanas. We just went through now what is mechuyev min haTorah. Midarabanan, every fruit and every vegetable is mechuyev. Every fruit and every vegetable. However, min haTorah, these are machlokes Rishonim. Is it all fruits? Is it only tirosh v'yitzar, wine and oil, even olives and grapes, maybe shivas aminim? You're ready to take Trumas and Maasros, you know what you're mechuyev to take from, and we already explained the Shiur. Could a person give Trumas and Maasros the whole thing? The person, he has a lot of different fields, and he figured, you know what, I don't even want to be busy with the tfu, I want to give the whole thing to the kohen. Could he take his whole field and give to the kohen the field? Then the answer is no. You can't give everything to the kohen. Just like by challah, is once a month the big Hafroshas challah. So you're there and you get so inspired. Instead of taking a little piece, you say, you know what? I want the whole thing should be challah. It's not chal. Mishnayos and truma mishnayos and other places. The din is challah also is truma. Truma means to take off. You have to take off from something else. That's truma. As opposed to giving the whole thing challah, the whole thing truma is not going to work. So you have to give something. You could give more than Meiser, let's say Trumas Meiser, or anything you want to give. You could give more, but you can't give the whole thing.
99% or 49%, so should be considered taking something from something.
Very good. You want to know what's the shear. You could go overboard, but what's the shear of overboard? That's a good question.
More than half is really not taking this from this, you're taking this from
Lamaisa, the Mishnah says, good, you're asking, very good. So what's the shear? How much do you need? There has to be a sheer nicker left over. In other words, you don't have to take off that most is left, but you need to take off. So as long as you leave something, you're taking off. Even if you're taking 90% and leaving 10%, has to be a sheer nicker. If you leave a dot, so then it's not nicker b'chlal that you're taking off from something else. Another important din to bring up over here, which is negeya legabi challah, also last week's shiur, we didn't speak about it. It's a shiur for itself, but an interesting concept. What happens if you're not going to eat the fruits? Do you have to take off truma? You're not going to eat it. Is truma only when you eat it? Means because you're going to eat it. For whatever reason, you're not eating it. For whatever reason, you're not eating the fruits, you're not eating it.
Selling it? What are you
No, if you're selling it, so then someone's going to eat it. Someone has to take off Trumas and Maasros. Very good. Good point. If you're selling it, someone's using it, someone's eating it, it's mechuyev Maasros. But let's say you're not eating it. Let's just think offhand quickly an example. You got, let's say, these bugs. Bugs infested the whole thing, you're not eating it. Mitzah toiloim. Or you're not eating it. Do you have to take off Trumas and Maasros? Rashi and Gittin, I'll just read the Lashon. Rashi says, "V'loi mitzvah deram yalei elon kein oichlon oy machron." You're only mechuyev to take off if you eat it or if you sell it. Like what you said, if you sell it, you have to. Would seem that if you don't sell it, if you don't eat it, you're not mechuyev to take off Trumas and Maasros. L'maisa, this is a milsim, a machloikis. It's a whole discussion. There's a big machloikas achroinim about it, and how to learn Rashi. Big machloikas achroinim lahalach, Reb Kiveger, the Taz, all over the place. If you're mechuyev, if you're not mechuyev, so it's a machloikas. It's not so common, it's not so negeya, but the din is an important din. Is the seder ma'akev? We're going now in the prati dinim of Hafroshas. We mentioned the din if you could take the whole thing off, not take off b'chlal if you're not going to eat it. Machloikis is the seder ma'akev, truma, ma'aser rishon, ma'aser sheni or ma'aser ani is the seder ma'akev. So the answer is it's absolutely ma'akev. The Torah says lo yisa'achad is a lav. He's a lav to take off. Not in the order. However, if you do take off, it's chal. You're not allowed to do it, but like the Mishnah says, if you take off shaloi kesidron, it's chal. We say it also in Vidu Maasros that you do at the end of the 3rd and the 6th year. So the pasuk says, Kechol mitzvah secha. Rashi teaches, what's Kechol mitzvah secha? You're saying, I did everything kedin. I took off Trumos, I took off Maasros, everything I did kedin. Kechol mitzvah secha, so Rashi explains that I took it off in order. Means if you take off the shaloi kesidron, that you're not, it's a lav.
Well, you're giving different amounts to different people, no? You're giving different amounts to different people, you're doing it out of order.
Well, again, I didn't.
If we do it out of order, different people they get different amounts. No?
So you're right about the amounts. It's really a good point, and it's a discussion, but it is like that clearly. That let's say you take off to the Levi before the Kohen. Just an example. What would be you took off Meiser 10% before the Kohen. So the Kohen doesn't lose out on the Truma. You have to calculate how much it would have been. Anyways, very good, 100%. Meaning to say is even if you're going to go Shaloi Kesidron, it's not going to be on the cost of anybody. You're going to have to calculate what would have been, how much if you do it Kesidron, what the amount would be. But if you do it, and it's chal, a person's over and alive, but it's chal. This is clearly in this week's staff, b'machshava. One could take Trumas and Maasros b'machshava, which means you don't have to say Harei zu Truma b'peh. You could take off Trumas and Maasros b'machshava. But what's about, do you have to actually take off the Trumas and Maasros? Or could you b'machshava and just have a mind, for an example? I'm not going to get into it b'chlal, but even the whole halacha l'maisa, I see, I was going to go into it a little bit, but it's very interesting if a person goes to Eretz Yisrael and you're not sure what the kashrus. Some people rely on a more kashrus that you don't rely on, and you're afraid there's no trumas amaisis. He's way at it how to do it, taking everything off. So you can even do it b'machshava, which means you're sitting at someone's house, you can have a b'machshava. But do you have to actually take off? It's a big shaila if you have to take off. But let's leave the halacha l'maisa on the side. Even always when you take off, you have a 10,000, 100,000 tons of tevuah. So you have in mind you want to take off, but could you have in mind that I want all the tevuah on the right, over on the right side is tevuah that you have to actually make a maisa hafrosha. Machlokes rishonim about it. Our Gemara says b'machshava, but Rashi says lashon Rashi in kedushin daf memala from at beis. Noisin einoi b'tzad zeh v'oichel b'tzad zeh. You could have a mind from one to the next place. The Rashba over there argues, and the Rashba says, no. You can't just look and have a mind, and that's all done. You could have a mind that you want to be mafresh, as opposed to saying harezu truma, but you have to take off truma. You have to take it off. Who mentioned before of Truma, I forgot, maybe Yisrael was you, about if Truma and Trumas Meiser is the same. So the Rashba is mesupik, if this din, what the Rashba says that you have to, Truma means you have to literally take off Truma, the Rashba is mesupik, is it also by Trumas Meiser? Or maybe only by Truma, that you have to literally take off Truma. And the Rashba says, V'nirali, since Truma and Trumas Ma'aser are the same, Mistaber, for this also it's the same. Meaning to say is for more or less everything it's the same. The Shaila is the Gabi this din. There's something that the Rambam says also, I'm forgetting now offhand, the Rambam also says something, because they're the same, it's the same din also.
The side thing, does the lady have to get anything besides Trumas Ma'aser, or is good to know? All the other things, I think before.
I'm almost sure that only Trumas Ma'aser, because everything else was Hafroshas already. Even what he gets, a Levi on his own field is a farmer, but when you ask, you're asking the Levi that got his matana from the farmer, so what does he have to do with that? It's pretty serious that he has to take it off. It's a same like Truma, you can't eat it. He has to give it to the Kohen, as opposed to, let's say, Ma'aser Rishon, or let's say Ma'aser Ani, or Ma'aser Rishon. What they actually do, Bizman Hazeh, the Shulchan Aruch says, since we don't know who are Leviim, you have to be mafresh it, because also you have to take off from the Ma'aser Rishon, Trumas Ma'aser, but you just keep it. Ma'aser Rishon, when the Levi has, he has to give Trumas Ma'aser. I don't think he gives anything else. I think it's Trumas Ma'aser. There's another din. It's a machlokes, but the Gemara over here only brings one shita, our daf, but important to note that it's only one shita and we actually don't paskin like that. Ba'oimid, could you take off ba'oimid? It's negei Trumas Ma'aser, because Truma really, when it's oimid, you just take off whatever you take off. Trumas Ma'aser. These are machlokes, tanoim. If you could take ba'oimid, our Gemara actually says you could, one man damar, Chachamim argue. And it's very interesting. Tosfos in Gittin Daf Lamed Aleph, Tosfos says something very interesting from the Yerushalmi. The din, that's the next din. But Tosfos also says about being makish. We want to know if Truma or Trumas Ma'aser. Tosfos says that we're makish. Yeah, well, we had earlier that Truma and Trumas Ma'aser were makish. It's the same din. So again, ba'oimid, these are machlokes. And l'maisa lahalacha, we say we don't take ba'oimid. Ba'oimid means to estimate. So if you have to take off 10%, it's 10%, not be'erich, figuring it out. It looks like 10%. You have to, something that you weigh, something that you measure, cubic, however you measure, that's what you have to take off. Min hamukiv, these are din min hamukiv, that you take off something has to be close by. These many halachas, what defines min hamukav, we're not going to go into it. It could be 10 shurim on min hamukav, but the concept of min hamukav is that when you take off, you can't take off from here to somewhere else. It has to be local. The gave by challah. I think I gave once a shiur about it, close by, within a box. What's machayev, min hamukav? So lamaisa min hamukav, it's an interesting shaila also. Where do you learn min hamukav? You learn in this week's parsha, v'harimoisa mimenu. But interesting, everything needs min hamukav, but over here. How's that possible? How's that possible? The min hamukav is right here, and you say over here by us, by Truba, you don't need it? So, Tosfos brings the Yerushalmi, this also is very interesting. Tosfos also over there at the Lamed Beis. Tosfos brings, says usually in all places you have a din here and you learn it elsewhere. Besides by Truma min hamukiv, that it teaches everywhere else needs to be min hamukiv, but here by Truma doesn't have to be min hamukiv. So just to conclude, mamish 30 seconds, there are dinim that is negayah, that's machayev, the fruits. First of all, number one, it has to be hegia la'oines ha'maisros, it has to be ripe. Obviously, these different shiurim for different fruits, but it has to be ripe. There's another din, it has to be gemar malacha, as opposed to if it's in the field and you didn't finish yet, it's not mechuyev. Look, the rice, the rabban, when you can eat it. And lastly, also, it has to be roya pnei abayis. In other words, we went through the whole shiur, and I'll make a quick sikum. We went through what's the nesinas are, what fruits are mechuyev. We went through dinei Hafroshas, very basic. But all this is still only negeya when the fruits are ready, are gemar malacha, roya pnei abayis, many different dinim. If you don't have that, it's also not mechuyev. Have a wonderful Shabbos.